Twinkling maps stream up the hill, past the farm and past the mill. Right at the top of Route 1 says, around noon like a Stilton cheese. That was the first poem written by W.H. Auden in 1922, entitled California, just at the age of 15, and that very much explains what a gorgeous, genius poet W.H. Auden was. Anyway, hello UPSC aspirants, welcome back to another learning video, and in today's video lecture I am going to look at W.H. Auden's very popular poem called Musse de Beaux Arts, which is also prescribed in your paper 2. W.H. Auden gained immense popularity when his distinguished poem called The Age of Anxiety was published in 1947, that also earned him Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Auden wrote 400 essays and presented his numerous views on social, political and psychological aspects through his poems. Now in our optional English literature syllabi, we have 10 poems by W.H. Auden. We're going to look at the first one, which is called Musse de Beaux Arts, in today's video. I've already made a video on the second poem, which is called Partition. You may want to go back and find out the link in the description box given below. Let's begin understanding our first poem, which is called Musse de Beaux Arts, which in English refers to Museum of Fine Arts, which happens to be a museum in Brussels. Now this was exactly the time when a lot of wars were happening. There was havoc in and around, which partly convinced Auden to write a poem like Musse de Beaux Arts. Now we figure out that the speaker in this particular poem walks through this gallery and he figures out these beautiful paintings that depict the suffering that embodies this world and the utter callousness and the indifferent attitude on part of human beings in and around the world. Now before we begin understanding the poem, let's first of all read the poem line by line together. So the poet begins it like this. He says, about suffering, they were never wrong. The old masters, how well they understood its human possession and how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot where dogs go on with the doggy life, and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. No man may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry. But for him, it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. Well, that ends our reading of Musse de Beaux Arts by W.H. Auden. Now let's begin understanding this poem line by line together. So the poet opens this poem like this. He says, about suffering, they were never wrong. Here we must question, what is this suffering? To be human in itself is a suffering. This material world where we are constantly living is nothing but suffering. And the fact that we do not realize that this material world is nothing but a suffering in itself is a cause of our bigger suffering. Right? So he says, about suffering, they were never wrong. Yes. And the old masters, how well they understood. Now here we may want to notice two important things. One, when the poet says in the beginning, about suffering, they were never wrong. So the word they here. And then he says, the old masters, how well they understood. The old masters. That should be our next question. Who are these old masters here? The old masters here refer to the great spiritualists, probably our forefathers, our great ancestors, who spent days and days, nights and nights, ages and ages, decades and decades in contemplating on what? In contemplating on, quote unquote, in Auden's words, which brings us to our next line, it's human possession. And what is this human possession according to the poet? This human possession is nothing but a load of suffering in this world. Now, if we delve deeper into this subject, what is this human possession that the poet is here trying to talk about? When a child is inside the womb of his mother, what happens? His hands and legs and everything is tied up. He wants to move out, but he's unable to do so. What is that if that is not suffering? And when this same child comes out and watches the world in all its tainted glory, he has these other set of things constantly tormenting him. College, university, marriage, and the list goes on. Right. This is the same suffering that the poet here is trying to talk about. It's human position, quote unquote, it's human position according to W.H. Auden. This human suffering that binds every single human being that takes birth on this planet. Now let's look at line number 4, where the poet says, while someone else is eating, or opening a window, or walking dully along. What does this line signify really? This line refers to the callous attitude of the people, the indifferent attitude of the people in this world. To give you an example, if I may say, there's a death ceremony going inside your neighbor's house. You may want to go there, probably visit them once, or even twice, or some even thrice. But we all may want to come back, return back to our everyday routine, to our normal routine, forgetting the anxieties, forgetting the torments of even our closest people in this world. So according to W.H. Auden, when he says while someone else is eating, line number 4, or opening a window, or walking dully along, he refers to the fact that humans really do not care for anybody. We may have a lot of sympathizing words, we may have a lot of empathy for other people around us, but in reality, at the end of the day, we do not really care for our very brothers, for our very sisters, their stress, their depression, their anxieties, their everyday torments at all. Let's look at line number 5, where the poet says, how when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, they always must be children who specially do not want it to happen. Now, in order to explain you these set of lines, I may want to give you an example. When you attend a wedding anniversary, what is that one thing everybody likes to offer to the couple? It's a bouquet or probably a bunch of fresh flowers. You don't want to give them old or worn-out flowers, right? You want to give them fresh flowers, probably beautiful, lovely flowers like roses. Similarly, in life, why do we want to wait to acknowledge the presence of Supreme Transcendental in our lives? Why do we keep this mentality, oh, I'm going to practice spirituality when I turn older? Right, so Auden here divides our society into 2 sections. One, when he says, how when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth. The miraculous birth here refers to the birth of Jesus Christ, like I already explained to you. Right? So the aged are reverently, passionately waiting. This part of the society that acknowledges the presence of Supreme Transcendental in their lives, that accepts the presence of Supreme Transcendental in their lives. And then he says, children who specially do not want it to happen. Right? The other part of the society hints at the other part of the society who does not acknowledge the presence of Supreme Transcendental in their lives, who do not even care for the mercy of Supreme Transcendental in their lives, who do not even want to know who this Supreme Transcendental is. Right? And then in the next line the poet says that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Dreadful martyrdom refers to the sacrifice of Christ, sacrifice that Jesus Christ made for this humanity. Right? His own followers betrayed him. His own followers. So imagine the amount of sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice, and Christ knew all of that. He accepted that. And yet, he chose to make that big sacrifice right? And there we all are. So the poet he asks this society, he questions, what have we really done? Christ has made a sacrifice. Have we really changed? Are we doing something for this society? This is Auden's question. Now, if you look at the last four set of lines from the first stanza, anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot, where the dogs go on with their doggy life, and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. Now, here this poet talks about another painting by Bruegel, which is called Massacre of the Innocents, in which we witness the slaughtering of young boys by the King Judah, who knew that Christ, the messenger of God, will now lead the new society, will now lead the new world that eventually leads to his fall. And here, if you also look at images such as doggy life and torturer's horse, these images, they're symbolic of the society that does not care for the greater things in life, that has no purpose in life, that does not acknowledge the sacrifice that Christ made for the humanity. Now, this last stanza gives detailed explanation of what happens in the third painting, which is called Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. According to a Greek mythology, Icarus ignored the warning of his father, who made Icaruses and his wings out of feather and wax. He instructed Icarus to not fly too close to the sun, since sun's heat would melt his wings. But Icarus neglected his father's warning, flew too close to the sun, causing his wings to melt, that eventually led to his fall. Now, this particular stanza also describes how people ignored Icarus's suffering and pain through two examples. Number one, if you look at the second line from second stanza, quite leisurely from the disaster, the plowman may have heard the splash. So this plowman who ignores the pain and suffering of Icarus. Number two, through another example, if you look at the last set of lines, the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. The second example, where they talk about this expensive, delicate ship that probably carried some rich people with influence and power who too chose to neglect the cry and pain of Icarus, watching his collapse, his pain, his suffering very, very silently. So we see how deeply Auden describes the condition of this modern world that you and I are living in. A world that is full of emotions like jealousy, depression, stress, anxiety, hunger, this hunger for power, this intoxication of power that defines the very so-called modern world that we are all living in at the present moment. In the words of George Orwell, if you want a picture of future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. So what we learn from this beautiful, beautiful contemplative poem by Auden is that real knowledge is not storing masses of data in our heads. Real knowledge is the ability to recognize a love for the transcendental. It's the ability to acknowledge the presence of that supreme transcendental in our lives. Because if we have that love for that transcendental in our hearts, we automatically have love for our fellow beings and friends. So real wisdom, real knowledge is the ability to recognize, to acknowledge, and to spread that love of supreme transcendental amongst our friends. That love that connects us with him, that binds us with him, that love which is everlasting and unflinching. Well, that ends our poem here. Thank you for joining me. To join our optional English literature classes, you may call us at 8865028865 or log on to finlandacademy.com for any information related to the courses. Thank you for joining me and stay very, very safe. I'll see you soon in my next video.